What if the greatest financial manipulation in history did not begin with the names you already know, but with a forgotten family that controlled entire currencies long before the Rockefellers ever appeared? This question may feel unsettling at first, almost like stepping into a chapter of economic history that was never meant to be opened. Yet this hidden world is exactly where the foundation of modern monetary power was built, quietly, strategically, and far earlier than most people realize. When we think about global finance, we usually imagine powerful banks, colossal empires, or 20th century magnates shaping the fate of nations. But the truth is that long before these figures emerged, a single family had already mastered the art of manipulating value, orchestrating currency flows, and influencing economic cycles in ways that still echo through the system we live in today. To understand how deep this influence goes, imagine a world where money was not just a tool of trade, but a weapon used in silence, capable of shifting entire economies without ever firing a shot. This family operated in the shadows of early financial markets, using knowledge, connections, and unprecedented foresight to detect patterns long before governments or institutions even realized what was happening. Their moves were subtle, almost invisible, yet devastatingly effective. They understood the psychology behind value, the fragility of trust, and the hidden mechanisms that made currencies rise and collapse. And while history may have credited others for building the modern financial world, these early manipulators were the ones who first shaped the blueprint. As you follow this story, notice how each detail reveals a deeper layer of the system we still depend on today. The patterns of fraud, speculation, inflation, and artificial scarcity did not originate in the modern era. They began here, with strategies designed to exploit vulnerabilities in trade routes, monarchies, and early banking networks. And although their name has faded, their methods created a ripple effect that future dynasties would later refine and expand. Before we go deeper, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt that the financial crises we witness today are not accidents, but part of recurring patterns that someone, somewhere, benefits from? Share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like if this topic resonates with you, and check if you are already subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. Because what you are about to discover may change the way you see economic history forever, and this is only the beginning as we move toward the next layer of this hidden financial legacy. The deeper you look into the financial roots of this forgotten dynasty, the more you begin to see how their rise was anything but accidental. Their origins were wrapped in anonymity, tucked within the small trade networks where merchants, lenders, and early financiers experimented with the concept, a value long before it became a formal system. This family observed everything with extraordinary precision. They learned that in a world where kingdoms rose and fell overnight, the most powerful asset was not land or armies, but information. And once they understood that, they built their foundation quietly, gathering knowledge that others overlooked and turning it into influence that no one could see coming. Their first moves came from studying the weaknesses embedded in primitive financial exchanges. Bartering was unstable, early coins were inconsistent, and monarchs frequently devalued their own currencies to fund wars or maintain control. These flaws created fertile ground for anyone bold enough to analyze patterns that most traders considered random. The family noticed how scarcity could be engineered, how the flow of precious metals could dictate the wealth of entire regions, and how even rumors could tilt markets. They learned to anticipate fluctuations before they occurred, using insight rather than brute force to position themselves advantageously. With every cycle, they expanded their reach. While other merchants focused on accumulating physical goods, they concentrated on controlling the mechanisms behind those goods. They understood that if you controlled currency itself, everything else naturally followed. They leveraged relationships with caravans, ports, and small royal courts, building a network that operated beneath the radar of larger powers. Each connection gave them first-hand access to information that would later define financial decision-making. When taxes shifted, when shipments delayed, when rival families made risky bets, they became masters at reading the subtle signals that revealed the beginnings of economic turbulence. But what truly set them apart was their ability to treat money not as an object, but as a moving force shaped by human behavior. They recognized patterns in how people reacted to uncertainty, scarcity, or opportunity. These insights allowed them to predict economic moods long before such concepts existed in formal studies. And with each correct prediction, their confidence grew, as did their reputation among those who subtly benefited from their guidance. As their influence continued to expand, the family realized something even more powerful. The institutions surrounding money were far more fragile than anyone dared to admit. This fragility became their entry point into a much larger game, one that would soon transform their quiet operations into a form of financial control no one could openly attribute to them. And it is precisely at this moment that the story begins to reveal how their hidden power evolved into something far greater than early trade networks could contain. As the family entered this new phase of influence, their strategy shifted from merely observing financial fragility to actively shaping it. They understood that the true power in any economy was not held by those who produced wealth, but by those who controlled the perception of stability. Early financial systems relied on trust, often fragile and easily shaken by rumors, fluctuations in supply, or political instability. The family recognized that whoever could anticipate and manipulate these psychological triggers would command an authority far greater than any monarch or merchant. This realization pushed them into an era of calculated interventions that would redefine how currency behaved across borders. Rather than interfere openly, they operated through subtle adjustments that exploited weaknesses already present in the system. They began by influencing the flow of precious metals, the backbone of early money. By strategically redirecting shipments, delaying deliveries, or accelerating exchanges, they created artificial scarcity or sudden abundance. These moves triggered predictable reactions in local markets. Merchants hoarded coins, prices fluctuated, and rulers scrambled to stabilize their economies. Each reaction reinforced the family's understanding of how malleable monetary value truly was. They learned that minor shifts, executed at the right moment, could send ripples through entire regions. Their knowledge of trade routes became one of their most powerful tools. By positioning themselves as indispensable intermediaries, they gained the ability to observe currency movements in real time, something few others could do. Caravans crossing deserts, ships navigating uncertain waters, and merchants traveling between emerging cities all relied on networks the family strategically controlled. These relationships allowed them to track not only physical goods, but the flow of information that determined economic confidence. When they sensed instability in one region, they directed resources elsewhere, ensuring they remained insulated from losses while others faced sudden financial storms. But their most sophisticated skill emerged from recognizing patterns long before anyone else noticed them. They studied repeated cycles of inflation, deflation, and speculative behavior, identifying the underlying causes that connected them. These insights became the blueprint for their manipulation techniques. They learned when to withdraw metals from circulation to trigger panic, when to release them to simulate recovery, and when to allow markets to collapse in order to buy devalued assets at a fraction of their worth. Their actions were always timed, perfectly, giving the impression that they were simply fortunate observers of unpredictable events, when in truth, they were orchestrating outcomes behind the scenes. The more they refined these methods, the clearer it became that they were operating on a level no one else understood. While other traders focused on visible transactions, the family concentrated on inverting the very dynamics that governed monetary value. Their control was not loud, confrontational, or obvious. It was precise, invisible, and built upon knowledge that had taken decades to accumulate, and with each successful intervention, their confidence grew, pushing them toward even more ambitious forms of manipulation that would eventually expand beyond markets and begin influencing the very decisions made by those in power. As their confidence expanded, the family began to experiment with a far more complex dimension of financial power, influencing decisions made by rulers, councils, and economic advisors without ever appearing at the center of the action. What they had learned from years manipulating scarcity and abundance gave them a unique advantage. They no longer needed to wait for instability to appear. They could create it. And once instability emerged, governments inevitably sought guidance, often turning to those who seemed to possess uncanny foresight. This positioned the family as quiet informants, trusted not because of their name or status, but because their predictions were consistently accurate, even when the political landscape shifted dramatically. This was the moment when their operations entered secrecy of another magnitude. Instead of directly participating in the visible flow of metals or trade, they cultivated intermediaries who could speak on their behalf, whispering warnings, offering suggestions, or presenting solutions that subtly steered the decisions of entire regions. These suggestions were rarely forceful. They often appeared as neutral observations or rational advice. But each recommendation nudged rulers toward outcomes that aligned perfectly with the family's interests. If a monarch hesitated to raise taxes, an advisor would share a forecast about impending shortages. If a council debated whether to stabilize the currency, a merchant aligned with the family would propose a move that seemed logical, yet served a deeper strategy. The true brilliance of their approach lay in the fact that they never had to reveal their involvement. Their network was layered with people who benefited from their insight, people who believed the family's strategies were simply the product of observation and experience. Over time, these layers created an ecosystem where decisions appeared independent, natural, and inevitable, when in truth they were the result of delicate manipulation. The family understood that currencies were not only shaped by supply and demand, but by emotions, expectations, and fears. And by influencing the people responsible for policy, they shaped these expectations at their source. They also crafted an image of detached expertise, allowing rulers to believe that they themselves were making wise choices. This illusion of autonomy ensured that the family's role remained invisible, preventing suspicion or backlash. Their guidance was subtle enough to blend into the broader logic of governance, yet strategic enough to shift entire monetary policies. Whether through altering minting practices, adjusting the release of metals, or influencing trade restrictions, their fingerprints remained untraceable. What mattered was that the outcomes moved in their favor, consolidating their growing dominance over financial dynamics that most people still believed were governed by chaos. As their influence expanded quietly through these channels, a new reality formed. They were no longer simply predicting crises or manipulating markets. They were shaping the very structures that determined how currencies behaved. It was a transformation that would push them into even deeper corridors of power, where the lines between economics and politics became nearly indistinguishable, and where their control would evolve into something even more sophisticated. As the family's influence seeped into political decision-making, their next step became almost inevitable, building a network of alliances strong enough to secure their dominance across generations. This was not a matter of simple partnerships or casual exchanges. It required a carefully orchestrated system of mutual dependence, where merchants, advisors, and small lending houses all benefited from aligning with a force that seemed to predict the future with uncanny accuracy. Word spread quietly, carried through trade routes and financial circles, about individuals who always seemed to know when to pull back, when to invest, and when to disappear from a collapsing market just in time. Those who sought stability in a world defined by uncertainty were drawn to this silent compass. The family understood that stability created loyalty. They offered protection not through force, but through foresight. By informing certain allies of shifts in supply chains or potential disruptions in trade, they positioned themselves as indispensable guides. In return, these allies provided access to new territories, influential clients, and confidential information. The network expanded organically, yet every connection served a calculated purpose. Each merchant or financier added another layer to the family's reach, enabling them to obtain real-time data from regions they had never even visited physically. By the time their influence stretched across multiple trade hubs, they no longer needed to intervene directly in most operations. Their network became a self-sustaining mechanism, a vast web of people who, knowingly or unknowingly, reinforced their power. This structure mirrored the early prototypes of global financial systems, long before banks and institutions formalized these connections. Through relationships that blended trust, dependence, and shared opportunity, the family effectively built the first blueprint of an international monetary engine. Their understanding of how value moved between regions became sharper, enabling them to identify moments when currencies would destabilize, often before local authorities had any hint of trouble. At the center of this network was a principle that would later be adopted by powerful financial dynasties. Influence is strongest when it appears decentralized. By operating through dozens of intermediaries, the family avoided suspicion and strengthened the illusion that their insights were simply scattered observations from various merchants. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, they analyzed patterns that connected all these reports into a coherent map of emerging financial shifts. It was this bird's-eye perspective that allowed them to anticipate economic cycles repeatedly, reinforcing their mystique and encouraging more people to quietly seek their guidance. This consolidation of power created a foundation they would later leverage to manipulate entire monetary climates with more precision than ever. Their allies trusted their instincts so deeply that even subtle suggestions could redirect trade routes or shift investment decisions. And as these shifts accumulated, the family's strategies increasingly shaped the flow of wealth across regions. Their influence became woven into the economic fabric of multiple societies, hidden in plain sight, quietly steering the gears of prosperity and collapse without leaving visible traces. Everything they had built up to this point prepared them for a far more expansive level of control, one where their manipulation would no longer focus solely on trade or scarcity, but on the broader mechanisms of geopolitical conflict and economic survival. The story now moves toward the moment when their reach intersects with the rising tensions of nations, turning their financial mastery into a force capable of altering the course of history itself. As the family's influence expanded into a vast financial web, their understanding of power shifted once more. They began to see that currencies were not only shaped by trade routes or political decisions, but by moments of conflict that forced entire nations to reorganize their economies overnight. Wars, territorial disputes, and diplomatic tensions created volatility that most merchants feared, yet volatility was the precise environment where this family thrived. They realized that geopolitical instability offered fertile ground for manipulating currencies on an even larger scale, because governments under pressure were far more predictable in their desperation. What made the family so effective in this realm was their ability to operate in the background, observing the movement of weapons, grain, precious metals, and political alliances with the same precision they once applied to simple trade routes. While kings and generals focused on battlefield strategies, the family concentrated on the economic consequences those battles would produce. They learned to forecast when a region would experience shortages, when a kingdom would need emergency loans, or when an empire was weak enough to be influenced through financial dependency. Their presence was never acknowledged publicly, but their decisions often shaped the financial conditions that determined whether a conflict expanded or dissolved. Their strategy relied on supplying resources to both sides of a dispute, not in the form of weapons or armies, but through access to currency and credit. Many rulers believed they were negotiating with independent lenders or wealthy merchants, never realizing these intermediaries were part of a coordinated network controlled by the same unseen force. By providing liquidity to one region and quietly restricting it in another, the family could tilt the economic balance of a conflict without ever taking a political stance. Sometimes they fueled growth, other times they quietly suffocated it. What mattered was maintaining control over the flow of money in moments when nations were too distracted to question the origins of their financial lifelines. Their mastery grew even more sophisticated as they started analyzing patterns in how empires responded to crises. When a state prepared for war, it hoarded metals, raised taxes, and borrowed heavily. When a war dragged on, its currency weakened, trade routes fractured, and markets panicked. These predictable cycles allowed the family to position themselves in advance, acquiring assets that would later skyrocket in value or withdrawing from markets before they collapsed under the weight of conflict. Their accuracy in forecasting these shifts created a sense of inevitability around their operations, as though they possessed an understanding of global dynamics far beyond the knowledge of any ruler. But what truly elevated their influence was their ability to remain invisible even as their impact grew. They never attempted to dominate through title or recognition. Their presence lingered between the cracks of economic decisions, whispering through advisors, merchants, diplomats, and financiers who believed they were acting independently. Through these channels, the family shaped the mechanisms that determined the cost of war, the stability of currencies, and the financial resilience of empires. Each conflict, regardless of its scale, offered them new insights that refined their understanding of human behavior under pressure. By the time nations began to recognize the importance of centralized financial institutions, this family had already spent decades manipulating geopolitical crises with a precision no emerging bank could replicate. Their influence had grown so deeply intertwined with the flow of money that their next evolution would take them beyond conflict-driven manipulation and into the realm of controlling currency itself as a strategic instrument where value, trust, and power could be reshaped at will. As the family moved closer to controlling currency itself, their strategies evolved from manipulating isolated events to shaping the broader emotional landscape that dictated how entire societies perceived value. They understood something that few leaders, merchants, or scholars grasped at the time. Money was not just metal or paper. It was belief. It was confidence. It was an invisible agreement that could be reinforced or shattered depending on who controlled the narrative around it. This shift in understanding marked the beginning of a new era in their manipulation, one where currency became a silent weapon capable of weakening enemies, elevating allies, or reshaping political outcomes without a single confrontation. To weaponize money effectively, the family analyzed how populations responded to whispers of instability, sudden abundance, or unexpected scarcity. A rumor about a king debasing his coinage could reduce trust overnight. A shipment of precious metals arriving at a strategic moment could restore confidence instantly. The family began to orchestrate these emotional fluctuations intentionally, adjusting the flow of currency to create the illusion of stability or crisis, depending on what benefited their long-term goals. They learned that when people feared economic collapse, they made desperate decisions. When they felt secure, they became predictable. And predictability was the key to long-term influence. Their manipulation operated across multiple layers. At the surface, markets reacted to shifts in supply, demand, and trade. Beneath the surface, advisors and financial intermediaries spread carefully crafted messages that amplified or softened market reactions. And, at the deepest level, the family's strategy shaped the foundations of trust itself, influencing how communities and rulers interpreted the signs of economic change. A simple message delivered at the right moment could redirect investments, alter trade routes, or destabilize a regional currency faster than any military campaign. Through this complex system, they discovered a profound truth. Controlling the perception of money was more powerful than controlling money directly. When people believed a currency was strong, they acted accordingly. When they believed it was weak, they triggered the very collapse they feared. The family became experts at nudging these beliefs, guiding societies toward outcomes that fortified their position in the shadows. Their influence grew quietly, like a current beneath the visible waves of commerce, steering financial behavior without ever revealing its source. As these techniques matured, their impact extended beyond the markets and into the fabric of everyday life. Farmers felt the effects in grain prices. Merchants adjusted their routes. Rulers reconsidered alliances. Families' invisible hand-shaped decisions that individuals believed were their own, yet these decisions all flowed toward outcomes the family had anticipated long before anyone sensed a shift. Their manipulation of currency had become an art form, one executed with patience, precision, and an eerie understanding of human nature. As their mastery over perception grew, the family began to refine techniques that would ultimately outlive them, evolving into frameworks recognizable in modern financial manipulation. The patterns they crafted were subtle yet powerful, and they emerged from decades of observing how societies responded to uncertainty. What fascinated them most was the consistency of human behavior, regardless of region or political structure. Fear always accelerated collapse. Confidence always delayed it. Greed always created openings. These universal reactions allowed the family to design mechanisms that could be repeated, adapted, and scaled far beyond their original environment. One of their most effective strategies involved exploiting the natural delays in communication across early trade networks. In an age where news traveled slowly, timely information was as valuable as precious metals. The family learned to manipulate this delay, selectively releasing information to certain regions while withholding it from others. This allowed markets to shift unevenly, creating waves of predictable imbalance. When a distant territory learned of a shortage too late, merchants rushed to compensate, driving prices upward and exposing themselves to losses that the family had anticipated days or weeks earlier. The asymmetry of knowledge became one of their greatest advantages. But their influence extended beyond timing. They studied how currencies behaved under structural stress, recognizing that a rapidly expanding empire often diluted its own coinage to sustain growth. When they sensed that a ruler had reached the limits of expansion, they quietly positioned the resources to benefit from the inevitable devaluation that followed. Conversely, when a region began stabilizing after turmoil, they acquired assets at depressed prices, knowing that confidence would soon return. They treated economies as cycles, not events, believing that every rise contained the seed of the next fall and every collapse the foundation of a future recovery. As their insights deepened, they began constructing broader models of manipulation. These models combined trade, analysis, political forecasting, and psychological behavior into a cohesive system that allowed them to influence currencies at multiple levels simultaneously. With a network that stretched across borders and social classes, they could detect shifts long before local markets reacted. Every piece of information flowed through their channels. A sudden tax increase, a failed harvest, an unexpected inheritance, a lost caravan. Nothing was too insignificant. Every detail contributed to a larger map of vulnerabilities that could be exploited with precision. Their methods grew so refined that their actions no longer resembled intervention, but orchestration. Markets reacted in ways that seemed organic, even inevitable, yet these reactions had been shaped by decisions the family made long before any visible change occurred. The beauty of their system, from their perspective, was its invisibility. Power that could not be traced was power that could not be challenged. And by ensuring that no single ally, merchant, or advisor possessed the full scope of their operations, they maintained control over a mechanism that appeared decentralized, yet functioned in perfect harmony. What emerged from this evolution was a toxic legacy, a blueprint for financial manipulation that future dynasties would later adapt with far greater resources and technologies. While the world believed it had progressed into more sophisticated financial systems, the truth was that these ancient patterns continued to pulse beneath the surface, shaping markets, influencing currencies, and guiding economic behavior in ways surprisingly similar to the methods crafted centuries earlier by this hidden family. As the centuries progressed, the world transformed, yet the patterns crafted by the family remained strangely persistent, resurfacing in new systems, new institutions, and new forms of currency. Emerging empires believed they were creating innovative financial structures, but unknowingly, many of their mechanisms echoed the original designs that this hidden dynasty had refined generations earlier. What changed was not the pattern itself, but the scale. Instead of manipulating caravans or regional markets, these methods now influenced nations, continents, and eventually global financial flows. The family's blueprint had become the silent architecture of modern monetary behavior, guiding decisions that millions interpreted as natural forces of economics. This continuity was possible because the core principles remained universal. Every system, no matter how modern, still relied on belief, trust, and perceived stability. Markets still panicked when confidence shattered. Currencies still collapsed when rulers overspent. Investors still surge toward opportunities shaped by emotion as much as logic. And central institutions, whether they admitted it or not, still reacted to the same pressures that had existed in the earliest civilizations. The family's early insights had simply translated into structures that scaled with technology, population, and international commerce. As global trade expanded, the asymmetry of information that once existed between distant cities now emerged between nations. Some governments received data more quickly, others lagged behind, and markets reacted at different speeds depending on their access to knowledge. This uneven flow created volatility that resembled the old world. Delayed reactions, sudden surges, misplaced confidence, and although new technologies promised transparency, they often amplified the family's old blueprint instead, making markets more reactive, not less. The same psychological triggers that shaped ancient currency moves now influence stock markets, commodity prices, and international borrowing. Even the concept of centralized banks echoed techniques the family had used centuries earlier. By controlling the supply of money, adjusting interest conditions, or influencing expectations, modern institutions inadvertently mirrored strategies once executed in secret. These banks appeared to operate with autonomy and science, yet the foundation of their influence relied on emotional perception just as much as the family's early interventions did. When a central authority announced changes, markets reacted instantly, not because of the physical shift in money, but because of the expectation of how others would behave. This circular logic was the same invisible force the family had once mastered. Meanwhile, financial crises across history continued to follow a hauntingly familiar sequence. Bursts of optimism leading to speculation. Speculation leading to excess. Excess triggering collapse. Collapse resetting the system for a new cycle. Each era believed its crisis was unique, shaped by its own politics and technologies. Yet, beneath the surface, the underlying pattern remained stable, almost rhythmic. It was as if the world kept reenacting variations of a much older script, one that the family had helped write long before economists attempted to explain these cycles with formulas and theories. As these parallels accumulate, it becomes harder to dismiss the possibility that the financial world we live in today operates on foundations far older, more fragile, and more deliberately molded than most people imagine. And while the family itself may have faded into obscurity, the influence of their ideas persists, shaping decisions and crises in ways that remain invisible to the vast majority of people who experience their consequences without ever understanding their origins. As the echoes of this hidden family's influence spread into the modern world, the most revealing truth emerges not from what they controlled directly, but from how their methods became embedded into the very psychology of global finance. Long before the rise of famous dynasties and celebrated magnates, they had already discovered that monetary power did not originate from wealth alone. It came from shaping belief, controlling information, and understanding the collective fears and ambitions that drive entire economies. Their techniques evolved into unwritten rules, absorbed into banking practices, market behavior, and political strategy without anyone realizing the source. What followed across the centuries was not the replacement of their ideas, but their expansion. As financial systems became more complex, they unknowingly amplified the mechanics this family had mastered in their earliest experiments. Market speculation grew more sophisticated, yet it still followed emotional cycles they documented generations earlier. Currency manipulation became institutionalized, yet it still relied on perceptions they once crafted in silence. Even the creation of national banks and international lending structures reflected, in a modernized form, the same principles that guided their network of advisors, merchants, and intermediaries. The world believed it was progressing, but it was refining a blueprint written long before it understood what financial power truly meant. What makes this legacy especially striking is how invisible it remains. History celebrates those who institutionalized the methods, not those who first discovered them. Modern economists analyze crisis cycles as if they emerged spontaneously, unaware that the patterns were recognized and leveraged centuries before they were studied academically. Governments respond to market shocks believing they are acting in the present, yet their reactions mirror behaviors shaped by early manipulators who understood how fear, scarcity, and uncertainty could be guided like currents in a river. The modern world thinks in terms of innovation, but so much of what appears new is simply the continuation of a far older script. And this raises an unsettling possibility. If these foundational patterns persisted through wars, empires, revolutions, and technological revolutions, then perhaps the financial system we live in today is not truly modern at all. Maybe it is an elaboration of ideas crafted by people whose names vanished from record, yet whose influence remains embedded in the psychological structure of global markets. The family may have disappeared into obscurity, but the world they shaped continues to function on assumptions they understood before anyone else dared to. If you reach this point, it means this story connected with you in a deeper way. So leave a comment saying the phrase "this." Story opened my eyes. It helps me know how far you followed this narrative and what resonated most with you. And if this exploration made you rethink how financial power operates behind the scenes, consider subscribing to the channel so you can stay with me as we uncover the next layers of these hidden mechanisms. Also, leaving a like helps this content reach others who ask the same questions you do. And if you want to continue this journey, there's a video right here that expands the logic behind these patterns. Click and move with me into the next chapter.